Good morning. Look, before I begin, I'd just like to firstly thank AIST for inviting me to speak today. As a financial planner, you don't often get the opportunity to speak at these kinds of events, and I really appreciate it. Like people in this room, I'm very interested in people getting the best outcomes of their superannuation accounts, and I love talking superannuation to superannuation people. I did ask AIST for 4 hours this morning and to have the doors locked, but unfortunately they only gave me 10 minutes. So what I'd like to talk to today is about how we can improve the superannuation tax incentive system. And the objective of today's session is just to give you some background into some problems with the current system, and just really to provoke some thought in regard to these problems and the ultimate goals of super, and of course my special proposal to change the system. Now, I wouldn't be a financial planner if I didn't have a disclaimer. So I need to point out that this presentation is my personal opinion only. It doesn't endorse any views of my employer, and it doesn't constitute any advice. So please don't act on any of the information I provide today. And in addition to that, the data sets are approximations only. So age pension, who gets it? I've been planning for 15 years, and I only just saw these figures recently and I found them really interesting. So of retired people, 75% of retirees get some kind of age pension or Centrelink from the government. And what's even more interesting about that is that 70% actually get the full age pension of that 75%. And it means that the government writes out a cheque of about $39.5 billion, and it's estimated that that's growing at around 7% per year. So I just want you to think of those numbers for a moment, because I believe that the superannuation system's main goal is really simply to improve that. But let's have a look at how we're doing, especially in relation to fairness and adequacy. So I just want to give you a tale of two different individuals. One individual earning $55,000 per year and salary sacrificing 20% of their income. So one of the benefits of the superannuation system is individuals are able to avoid some personal tax liability by contributing to super and obtaining a tax benefit. So if a gentleman on $55,000 a year contributes 20% of their income into super, they'd make a net tax savings of about $2,300. And over 10 years, that would sum up to about $23,000. And if we look at member number 2 or client number 2 on $105,000, if they were to contribute 20% of their income, they'd be able to generate a tax saving of about $5,000 per year, which would add up to $50,000. Now, I just make the observation that of those two individuals, it's much more difficult for the lower income earner to come up with that 20%. And yet the higher income earner gets the greater tax benefit. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I just question the balance from low income earners to high income earners and how they're incentivised to contribute to super. Now, one of the real benefits of superannuation when a person retires is that they're able to roll over their money into a superannuation income stream when they retire after 60 years of age. And if you were fortunate enough to be able to accumulate $4 million, for argument's sake, in a couple situation, which would be $2 million each, $4 million at 6% would deliver about $240,000 worth of income. And under the current rules, that income is received completely tax-free for the remainder of that person's life, given the current rules. And if we compare having that $4 million in ordinary investments. So in a couple situation, a husband and wife, a husband having $2 million in investments and the partner another $2 million, ordinary income tax would be somewhere around $75,000 per year. So the superannuation system would actually deliver them a net tax benefit of around $750,000 over a 10-year period. Now, the reason I've shown those two situations is that my personal view when I look at it is that it's just not as balanced as I'd like to think the system should be. And I don't think that the tax benefits go through equally to everyone. And after all, we need to do a much better job in looking after the little guy. So what's my idea? Well, ever since I started in superannuation, the one thing I could never understand is that the government wants people to save for retirement, but as soon as they put money into superannuation, it starts to be taxed. So my big new idea is that we just get rid of contributions tax and get rid of income tax on superannuation balances below $100,000. So let me give you an example of how this works. So if we have a hypothetical person who's entering the workforce at 20 years of age, earning $50,000 a year, and we index that to 3% inflation, we have 9.5% compulsory super, and we assume 6% net earnings after fees, 15% contributions tax, and around 12% in investment earnings tax. Then that individual at 67 years of age would have about $1.3 million. Now, if we remove contributions tax and earnings tax while her balance is below $100,000, she would end up with about $1.4 million, which is an increase of about $112,000. Now, it's not a huge increase, but when I did these numbers, I found something I thought was incredibly interesting, was that the contributions tax and earnings tax that was collected was about $200,000 over the client's working life. And interestingly enough, I thought the tax revenue would go down quite substantially. But what actually happened was the contributions tax went down, but because the balance was higher in the end, the amount of earnings tax went up. So you can see that the amount that the government collected between the two scenarios was fairly similar. So the genius of this idea is that theoretically, the government can get the same amount of tax revenue and our client can be better off. Now, there's only one problem with that. That's actually a little bit of a lie. Because the truth is that that doesn't take into account the time value of money. So for the government to be able to do this, they would actually have to defer a substantial amount of revenue, and I would estimate it's about 10 or 11 years in this particular scenario. So although the quantum of the money is the same, the government would actually have to take a huge haircut on tax-based revenue from superannuation. But as I showed you in the slides before, what I can tell you is that there must be some other ways to collect some of that shortfall in a more effective way. So for example, high net worth balances in retirement. The government's talked about introducing contributions tax for high net income earners, and I think that a lot of those ideas are very, very appropriate. I also did the numbers on 200,000 just to see what they would look like. And interestingly, again, the client was better off to the tune of nearly $200,000. And if you compare the tax collected, there wasn't too much difference in the amount of tax collected at the end of the day. So, is there problems with it? Well, yes, there are. So, we all know here, is the government willing to take a substantial haircut on the short-term tax revenue from superannuation? in the fiscal environment that we find ourselves in? I don't think so. I know some of the trustees and the administrators in the rule will think, how practical would it be to apply from an administration point of view? And one of the things that it would do is it would slightly increase the complexity of the system, and I continually hear all the time that we need to make the system simpler. But the one thing I do want to argue with you today is that it's my belief that this strategy is a captain obvious. It simply doesn't make sense to tax low balances on superannuation. Now, what are the benefits? So think about it for a moment. The tax benefits of this strategy will be continuous and ongoing. And the really important part of this is that it will really help individuals with either low incomes or low balances on a long-term and continuous basis. So there's issues around women leaving the workforce and not having superannuation. There's issues about some of the Indigenous issues about accumulating enough money for superannuation. And this tax benefit continues to help a person until the point in which they get at least $100,000. The other really good thing about it is that this also helps higher income earners, because in the initial stage of funding an investment, higher income earners will achieve their $100,000 balance a lot faster. And one of the things that we know with compounding interest is that that's going to have a very long-term effect over about 30 or 40 years almost. And I think theoretically the government could maintain the tax base. I don't have a definitive answer on how they would do that, but there are ways and means of changing the tax from the superannuation system to address that. So to me, everyone benefits. The individuals benefit by having a higher superannuation balance. The government benefits by paying out less social security in the end. And our funds benefit because we are able to provide our members and clients with a much better outcome. So just to quickly summarise, look, it's my view that the government must consider removing some of the benefits in super that are either unsustainable or perhaps even a little bit unfair. There simply must be a better way to create a balance of benefits between low income earners and high income earners, and low balances and high balances. And the superannuation system needs a design that creates a meaningful value as soon as possible. We have many accounts languishing under the balances of $100,000. Higher balances benefit everyone. Thank you.
Well done. If you just want to stay there, Tim, we can turn the lights up. Do we have questions on the floor or observations, comments about that presentation? The joy of compounding interest is the key to it all.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, well, we have just about used the allotted time there, so please thank Tim again for that contribution.
Thank you.
And our next speaker. Sorry, I haven't got my screen in front of me. I'm too busy taking notes on your proposal. I thought that was very interesting. Yeah. I like the deferred taxation stuff as well. All right, Bill Watson is next. He has 15 minutes. Bill, you might want to take 10 or 12 of that, and we'll see if there are questions at the end.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I've got to say thanks to AIST for giving me a chance to act like a yapping dog and bark at something that probably isn't there. And I'd also like to apologise to my trustees and compliance guy in advance, because I'm going to have a go at APRA and ASIC, so it probably means our next audits aren't going to end satisfactorily. What I wanted to talk about today was a different approach to the initiatives that both APRA and ASIC are doing on culture. You've probably seen the correspondence, and no doubt you've been wrestling with the issue about ASIC with its circulars and speeches talking about the need to have good corporate culture. And as these things are wont to do in our industry, APRA is following up the rear and it's focusing on risk culture. And they've said that that's a matter that they will be reviewing and engaging with trustees and boards and organisations over the next period of time. So they've both made it a priority. They'll audit and discuss it. And I've got no doubt that if something goes wrong in your organisation, they will identify, attribute some of that to poor culture within the organisation. So the first thing I've got to say about this is I find it a bit difficult that we've got ASIC talking about corporate culture, which we think is a large circle, and then we've got the other regulator talking about risk culture, which is just a subset of it. For our purposes, I think we really need to think about culture as a whole, and risk culture is just a minor part of it. So the starting point for me is, why are our regulators focusing on culture? And of course it's pretty obvious. The things that contributed to the causative factors for the global financial crisis were all about poor culture within organisations, particularly overseas. But we can't really take a pat on the back ourselves, because in Australia what we've seen, particularly over the last period of time, and particularly driven by some very good reporting by Adele Ferguson in the Fairfax newspapers, and hopefully she'll still have a job next week, is about a whole lot of failures within our financial system. So we've got the timber schemes, Storm Financial, Opes Prime, and then of course our favourite organisation at the moment, the Commonwealth Bank. And their organisational failures was Storm, insurance, financial planning, and we don't know what else is coming down the pike, but no doubt their well-oiled PR machine will keep us on top of that shortly. And then we've got other participants in the financial food chain, IOOF, Macquarie, ANZ with its rate rigging. So the first point for me in these things is that each of these represent a systemic failure, a failure within the organisation as a whole. And other organisations that run transport and health think about these things as systemic failures. And what they're evidence of is that the culture within the organisation has not worked. So, what's the problem that ASIC and APRA are trying to fix? What problem are they trying to solve? And from my point of view, I think it's really the retail sector doing bad things, but because we're all a part of this community, it's visited upon us as well. Now, I'd have to say, with the way that APRA and ASIC are approaching this initiative on culture, I don't have any reason to believe that things will change within those organisations unless you take a totally different view on how you embrace culture within financial services organisations. Now, APRA and ASIC aren't alone in dealing with this. In fact, there's a group of eminent ex-bankers and central bankers known as the Group of 30 who have been looking at risk culture and culture within financial services institutions over the last 5 years, and they released a report recently where they focused on that. And I think this group, the Group of 30, is really driving change, or attempting to drive change in financial institutions throughout the world. Now, the interesting thing about the Group of 30 is there's a whole lot of central bankers on it, so you give that a tick, but there's also some poachers on it as well. And I had a quick look last night, and some of those poachers were responsible for the destruction of quite a lot of shareholder capital, so I hope they've applied their learnings to improving things. Now, what the G30 and our regulators want is good culture. I think that's a really laudable aim, but my complaint is that I think they've drunk their own Kool-Aid and they've convinced themselves that they are special and different. And to be frank, they aren't special and different. What they say is that we need to focus on remuneration, alignment of remuneration practices with driving the right incentives. Now, if that happens in the banking sector, for one, I'd be delighted, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. Focusing on how people are promoted within organisations and policies. But my beef is that the Group of 30, ASIC and APRA, didn't look anywhere else. They didn't look to any other examples of how industries have gone about embedding great culture and improving things. And I think they fell for the classic thing, particularly that we see in the financial services sector. First of all, they thought they were smarter than the average bear, and secondly, because it wasn't invented here, they didn't look at it. They ignored the free lessons that we've seen in the airline industry, the maritime industry, rail industry and the medical industry. Now, each of those industries, driven by regulators and driven by thought leaders, have been focusing on creating safety culture within those organisations. So here today, you're actually sitting on top of Adelaide's rail system, and Adelaide's rail system is far more advanced in terms of having a safety culture, preventing things from going wrong, than the financial services sector. Now, It's all about creating resilient organisations, organisations that are capable of withstanding failure, avoiding systemic failure. Now, the first thing is I talk about safety culture, and I suspect for most people it means you're automatically thinking about occupational health and safety. But it's not just occupational health and safety. It's about stopping unwanted events occurring within organisations. It's preventing things from not going to plan and going wrong. Culture, what is it? And I think the shorthanded version of culture is the way they do things around here. It's something that's observable, it's something that you can see but not necessarily touch and feel. In some sense it's a bit like a handful of smoke. You grasp it and it disappears. But you can't make the assumption that just because you've got culture it's good. You can have bad culture, indifferent culture. From my point of view, culture is the desired state on what you want your organisation to be, and it then gives you the opportunity to plan on how you get there and stay there. So for the organisations in the industries that I talked about, their version of culture, a safety culture, creating resilient organisations, has got 4 elements: reporting, just, flexible and learning. What those elements do is create barriers. They create lines of defence, but not lines of defence as our risk and compliance people talk about it. Rather, it's an image of rotating wheels of Swiss cheese, and Swiss cheese has got holes in it, and if you don't have your defences all lined up properly, an event can penetrate those Swiss cheese and cause systems failure. The idea is if you've got sufficient defences through those elements, even though 1 or 2 holes might be penetrated, the whole lot won't be. So for reporting culture, what that's about is not just so much reporting things that go wrong, but it's also reporting things that sort of went right or you ducked and you avoided it. And I don't see a lot of evidence in the financial services industry where there's reporting of things that sort of was okay, but you know in your guts it wasn't right. Whereas in the aviation industry, they've got a culture where even where things are sort of okay, they still get reported. Why do you report it? Because it gives you free lessons. Why do you report it? Because if something sort of goes all right or you've avoided it, there's almost inevitably at a later stage it will go wrong. Just culture is all about people being able to stick their hands up and reporting things and not being punished. And of course last week we would have seen with the Commonwealth Bank stuff, the whistleblower gets the sack and gets hung out to dry. Just culture is not about people reporting stuff to avoid responsibility for it, and I've certainly seen that, but it's a culture that encourages people to report things and to know that they can do it without fear of retribution. Then there's flexible culture. What that's about is when organisations are under stress, you need different lines of reporting and you need different ways of responding. And sometimes that means that the people at the top don't need to lead, they need to delegate it or give responsibility to other people. And then there's the learning culture, and that for me is really important, which is you investigate, you conclude, and then you implement. But you also take the lessons from what you see elsewhere. So what I've seen in the maritime industry is there's a lot of reporting about what happens elsewhere and learning from other examples. I don't see much evidence of that in the financial services institutions. Don't see much at all. And then the final thing is, what you need is what they call crew resource management, which is the ability for people to challenge leaders and challenge those people in authority and say, that isn't right, we need to stop doing that. And the best example of why you need crew resource management was, and the starting point for this was a KLM and Pan Am jets crashing in Tenerife as one was taking over in 1977 with 583 lives lost. What the investigators found out was that the co-pilot in the KLM plane knew it was all going wrong, but he did nothing because he respected authority. And I've got to say, crew resource management is about not respecting authority, and it's about being able to stick your hands up and to stop things from going wrong. So my conclusion is, we're not smarter than anybody else. Just because we run other people's money, we're not smarter. We need to look to those who have successfully built culture and apply their learnings. What we need to do is describe our destination, to create the framework, and then hasten slowly. Thank you. There are no questions. I have stunned them.
I'm a pesky journalist. It's just a few bad apples. Don't you understand the damage you're doing to our financial services brand with that report that you want to run on 60 Minutes or the ABC? We just want to cover it up, actually.
We do.
And make money.
We do. But we
So all of that's well and good, but unless you've got a leader who's prepared to say the culture around here needs to change, because let's face it, there's a groundswell from the public to say we don't want planes to fall out of the sky or the trains underneath us to crash, nor do we want to continue to see these scandals in financial services. So the bottom-up's happening. Where's the top down?
So it's one of the things that regulators are saying, that the tone is set at the top, which I think is absolute rubbish in some sense, because you have a look at what's happened at the Commonwealth Bank. You've got a board that's in this ivory tower. What it really means is, for me, culture doesn't work unless it's shared by everybody. And if it comes from the top, most people, Australians' reaction is if they get a message that it's coming from the top, they're getting the sermon from the mount, they're going to ignore it. So it's actually, where I've seen it most successfully applied is where your middle management and where your other stakeholders are on board, and they're the ones that drive it from the middle, both upwards and downwards. To expect people to accept what the board says, I think is just rubbish. It doesn't happen.
But where does the impetus come from to drive that cultural change?
It's got to,
it sure doesn't come from the regulator.
No, it doesn't.
It's kind of stop, or I'll say stop again, as far as ASIC's concerned.
Yeah, so my point is it's got to come from within the organisation. It's got to be championed, obviously, by the executive management team, but they and they alone have... What they've also got to do is to be able to create other advocates within the organisation for change, because what you're talking about is changing the way people perceive these things. If we rely upon the regulator, all we're going to do is end up with an absolute bare minimum pass mark 50%. For me, I don't think that's acceptable, because we look after other people's money. What we've got to be aiming for is a 95% mark, and that's within the organisation, and that's something when they come on board the organisation, they understand that what are the non-negotiables.
All right, other questions in the room on this? Am I the only one worked up about this? Yes?
Graham.
Graham Russell, CEO of Media Super. So I just wanted to back you up, Alan, and say the other place it comes from is, frankly, pesky journalists. That's what has to happen, that this stuff has to be called out. And I think there's a long way to go. So this is more of a comment. But the other comment I'd make too is brilliant timing, Bill, because the regulators are presenting in another room right now.
That's absolutely right, which is why I'm in here.
But no, so I guess what I'm saying is I think this issue is a total community issue, and part of it is that it has to be called out. So what Adele has done is a good start, but there's a lot more to go. So for example, I don't think, and I don't know whether Bill's got a comment on this, that even the calling out of what's happened with CommInsure, there were examples of what it actually meant for individuals. But with the financial planning scandals across two banks, the reality of this is that a whole lot of people have actually lost their life savings or had their life savings diminished, and I'm not sure that's been totally called out and recognised yet.
Yeah. So the thing is, Graham, one of the reasons, the primary reason why the aviation industry has led safety culture, and to give an example, so that you've got safety scientists having a whole school of thought about the continuous improvement that's happened in the aviation industry, is because people got killed. Planes dropped out of the sky, windows opened up, there was urine corrosion in toilets, things fell out of the plane. So loss of life creates the impetus for change, loss of money doesn't. And that's the really sad thing about it. People, unfortunately, the change that I've seen, that you see in the aviation industry, rail industry, maritime industry and the health industry, it's only when people die that people sit up and take notice. Losing money, it's really sad, but we have destroyed people's lives. People commit suicide. That's not as proximate as a plane dropping out of the sky.
All right, I could go on about that forever, having spent a great deal of the early part of this century in Townsville, talking to people who'd invested with Storm Financial and the Bank of Queensland and the Commonwealth Bank. Commonwealth Bank did eventually say, having threatened to withdraw all their advertising from Channel 9, that they would put right what they'd done wrong, but it wasn't until the middle of last year that the North Ward branch at the Bank of Queensland, which was clearly writing low doc loans which didn't reflect the financial reality of individuals, it wasn't until the middle of last year, after a judge called them cowboys, that they by mutual agreement agreed to take a gold watch and go home. So I don't know what you have to do. So I'm a little bit jaundiced on those points, you'll forgive me. Rod White knows a lot about super. He's been in the business for a long time. It's his turn to present now. 10 minutes and questions to finish.
My rant is basically about thinking the industry super fund movement needs to do more in respect of the reverse mortgage space. I suppose when I first started working in industry super way back in the late 80s, I was a bit younger and more naive. And the industry funds, I suppose, had a view of really challenging the marketplace and really taking it up to the banks in respect of the products and services they provided. And I think to a certain extent they may have lost a little bit of that momentum and impetus, and I think it's something we probably need to try and get back again. One of the things I suppose I've got here as a point is what are the members' best interests, because that tends to drive a lot of what goes on within the superannuation movement. And I think it's become a bit too narrow over time. I think we think of best interests as being cost-driven or possibly only investment performance-driven. But I think there's a lot more there that we should be actually taking into consideration. And it's more about, well, what are the actual products and services that our members actually need? And do we have to provide products and services on a for-profit basis, or can we provide something that's more on a break-even basis, knowing that it is actually providing a better outcome for our members? Also, do we want our members going in talking to banks? From my experience, every time a member goes in and talks to a bank about possible bank products, they then get sold more and more products, and their footprint within the industry funds gets less and less. So I think we need to be trying to look at ways that we can stop the members going into the banks and having those discussions. So why an equity home release? By doing it, I think you can move the home, which is primarily a passive asset, into something that's more of an active asset, producing an actual income for you. I know super funds, as a general rule, don't have much direct exposure to the residential property market, but I think their overall investments have a significant exposure to the property market, because basically our whole economy, to a certain extent, is driven by the amount of wealth individuals have, and the amount of wealth individuals have is very much pegged to their principal residences. If you bring out an equity home release product, I think it also makes your members probably tied to your fund a bit more strongly than what they would be otherwise. I think there's an emerging trend at the moment that retirees in pension products are becoming more discerning, and they're probably more willing to become more mobile as time goes on, because they haven't got much, they're not out there working, so they do spend more time looking at what their fund's providing and what they're being given. And so I think by doing this, it will tie up the membership a bit more. And basically it's something that's targeted to the people who would be on the full age pension, or the majority of the full age pension. And if you've been on the full age pension, you probably haven't, your overall earnings through your working life have probably been less than average weekly earnings. And if that's the case, something like even an extra $5,000 a year can be an extra, considerable extra enhancement to your retirement income. There may be some Centrelink issues, so will you move an exempt asset into an asset that's inaccessible? Not sure about that one. And you will probably have an adverse situation under the incomes test. But again, if you're targeting the people on the full age pension, their assets and incomes are probably at such a level that probably won't even reduce the amount of pension that they receive. We've got 7 million people expected to enter retirement over the next 40 years. We've got 200,000 people turning 65 each year. If 8% of those do a reverse mortgage, then that's 16,000 reverse mortgages a year. So that's a fairly hefty growth rate. At the moment, the average balance at retirement for a couple is 300,000, and we know with averages, half the people have more than that and half the people have less than that. So this has certainly targeted those that account balances are well and truly below the average. The ABS stats also show that over 65s have more non-super financial assets than they do super financial assets. I think one of the reasons for that too is a lot of the people, when they reach retirement, if they don't have a large sum of money, they think, well, why leave it in the super system? I may as well just take it out and spend it. I think this is a way of tying in that money, again, longer into the fund. So in essence, you'd have two accounts. You'd have your superannuation savings account and you'd have your reverse mortgage account, which sit side by side to each other. I think the traditional views of family is that the home is something that I want to pass on to the kids is slowly changing. I think children themselves are saying to their parents, well, look, I'm more concerned about you having an adequate income in retirement. So if you can make use of your principal home, why not? It also stops people downsizing, because you don't have to downsize if you don't have to, so it allows people to stay in their home for longer than what they potentially could do. There's also a real push at the moment for annuities. And whilst annuities are very good products and entirely appropriate for some segments of the society, I think for the people who have worked the more traditional blue-collar jobs, the ones that are doing their physical work and labour, they probably cross-subsidise people in annuities. Because if you're going to pass away before average life expectancy, you're potentially going to lose out of an annuity. Whereas if you're going to live longer than average life expectancy, you're the winners. So I don't think annuities are necessarily the solution for a lot of the members of the industry super funds. Also, what's longevity risk? Is longevity risk just purely outliving your savings? Or is longevity risk also including things like not meeting your estate planning needs? You're not passing on to your children what you want it to pass on. And I know there is some debate at the moment that super shouldn't be for that, but that's certainly going to be a cultural change, because I think most people look at their super as being something that they can pass on to their children. Also, with annuities, it's money that's then lost to the super industry. So if we can come up with a solution to stop the annuities, at least it's money that's still retained within the superannuation system. And finally, I think there's some real questions about the survival rate of annuity providers. If you have a look at the organisations that provided annuities 30 to 40 years ago, how many of them are still in existence now? So I think there is that risk that if you take out annuity with a provider, will they still be around in 20, 30 or 40 years' time? Banks are also waking up to this growing market segment, and they're becoming really active. The actual reverse mortgage marketplace has certainly developed and matured over the years, and I think it's still got a little bit longer to go, but banks are certainly becoming more and more active. There's basically two ways that you could do a reverse mortgage. You can do a reverse equity, or you can sell a portion of your house. A reverse equity is basically where you take out a mortgage, you pay interest on that mortgage, or if you don't pay interest, that mortgage accrues at the interest rate. And then when you sell your house, you pay off the mortgage and the balance is left with you. The other option, as I said, is to sell the portion of a house. So if you sell 25% of the value of your house, that percentage is then locked in place, so then when you sell your house eventually, you retain 75% of the sale portion. I'm not sure which way is the better way, and probably an option of two allows members to then pick the option that's right for them. probably need some regulatory change if we are going to do it. There could be some issues with the contributions caps. We don't want people to have to pay more tax through breaching the caps than what they actually need to. And there could be, as I said, some Centrelink issues. Are you moving something from an exempt asset into an assessable asset, and also the incomes test. Who are they targeted at? Well, obviously homeowners. It's targeted at people with limited superannuation savings, primarily those that are on the full age pension, and it's those who only need a small supplement to existing income sources to try and maintain their current standard of living. Suits those that may be wanting to leave an inheritance, but they also want to provide themselves some extra income, and it's especially suited to those that think they may pass away before average life expectancy. So just an example, we've got a couple aged 65, their pre-retirement net income was 72,000 and 70% replacement rate would be 50.4, home value of 300,000, they've got 100k in combined retirement savings, they released 75,000 of their home equity, they're on the full age pension of 34,000, they're what I can call a conservative investor, so a long-term average return of approximately 6%, and if they pay an equity release mortgage rate of 8%, where would it leave them? So at the moment their net worth would be 450,000. After 5 years they'd have 453,000, 10 years 444,000 and 15 years 413,000. So their net worth position doesn't really change that much. They've maintained their 70% replacement rate income, and they're still leaving an inheritance for their children because their equity in the house is still approximately 47%. So that's all I've got on reverse mortgages.
Questions? Questions for Rod? What's to stop superannuation funds developing this product and promoting it now?
Lack of appetite, I believe. As I said, the banks are in there. You need to set up an arrangement with the bank probably. And the retirement income products for super funds is still maturing. A lot of funds 10 years ago didn't even provide a retirement income product, whereas now most do, but this is then an extension of that.
And so if the risk is having to do business with the banks and develop an understanding, again we come back to financial literacy around this stuff, which is the bigger challenge? Because I mean I think you're right, I think the desire to hang on to the family home worth $3 million and live in penury, that's wearing a bit thin. I think the message is getting through that, you know, you're not entitled to everything your parents, you know, have ever saved for. That's not your birthright. So what's the greater obstacle? Is it the dealing with the banks?
Well, I think the greater obstacle is, one, having the relationship with the banks. There is the investment performance side of things. How does the superannuation fund categorise them? Because the way I envisage it would work, the superannuation funds would place a sum of money with the banks, and the banks would then use that to fund the reverse mortgages. So what rate are the funds getting from the bank on the money that they place with them? How do the funds categorise that investment? Is it part of their cash investment? Is it a part of their fixed interest investment and whatnot? It's also, do the big banks necessarily want to deal with industry funds on this sort of product? I'm not sure, but it could be an opportunity for the second tier banks. I think the second tier banks would be keen to enter into this space.
Any other? Oh, here we
are. It's a nice big idea. Is it the kind of thing that a super fund would do on their own? It sounds to me like it's more the kind of thing, we've got industry fund ... Is this the kind of thing that a standardised product rolled out across the industry fund network would really be perhaps the way to go?
I think the economies of scale by doing it on a collective basis would certainly be more powerful and probably have a broader impact. From my experience, funds like to have their own little taste and flavour on certain things, so they'd probably want to have it tailored to their own specific requirements. But if you can achieve that, again, on a collective basis, I think that's the way to go.
There's a question at the back of the room. There's a microphone down there.
Yeah, just industry funds are so trusted. It's one of our great differentiators versus the banks. Don't you think we put that all at risk if we foreclose on someone that we've been, managing their retirement savings for all their lives?
Why would you foreclose, for a start? Because if you put certain rules around how much equity people can get access to, there is the government rule also that you can never enter into a negative equity situation. And if the basis of it is that you don't have to actually make repayments until you actually sell the property, I'm not sure why or where you'd ever actually get to a foreclosure situation. You might, but I'm not sure what the circumstances would be there. There is a risk that property values will plummet, and so the value of the reverse mortgage is greater than the value of the property, but that's where, again, if you restrict it to no more than 50%, you should be able to avoid those situations happening.
Here we are.
Rod, you probably thought about this, but how does this rub up against government policy, stated or understated, which wants to blast the baby boomers out of their 4-bedroomed empty nest houses to get them into smaller properties, to get families into the houses to solve the supply and housing affordability crisis? So aren't you up against a government policy pushing in the other direction?
Well, as I said, this is really targeted to the lower socio-economic, I suppose, aspects of society. So it's not the people in the multi-million-dollar houses that this is targeted towards. It's those whose property values are sort of no more than about 300,000. It's those that can they downsize much from that? That they can physically, but in value size, can they downsize much from that? Probably not.
And do you restrict it to that class of people, to that group of people?
I don't know if you restrict it, but that's who you really target it and promote it to.
That's who it's most attractive to.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, who need the money. Yeah.
And I think you can create certain rules around it. You may have it operate similar to what the old term allocated pensions. So you restrict access to lump sums and whatnot, so make it a genuine retirement income product.